What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my retrospective review of Fallout 3, a game I just recently played for the very first time myself, despite it initially releasing all the way back in 2008. With that in mind, this is actually the last mainline Fallout game I had not actually played, including the original two isometric CRPGs, New Vegas, 4, etc. So naturally, this is something I've been meaning to do for a while, given how popular the game is, of course, as it was simply a gap in my knowledge that I planned on sorting out for myself. And after playing and running through the content with this particular title, I can say that a lot of things became clear to me in terms of the opinions and things I've seen expressed about this game by others, but obviously this video is going to be more focused on my own opinions, but seeing how I've played all of the other games, I will absolutely be referencing them here and there, so that's something to know. What's more, I'm playing this game specifically with the Steam Game of the Year version, which means of course that we are on PC. But with those qualifiers out of the way, let's talk about the rest of the game. Now, Fallout 3 had a pretty monumental task right out of the gate. It had to bridge the gap between the original isometric CRPGs, which on their own had their own set of problems and dramas surrounding their development, but nonetheless they had to incorporate all of that, faithfully represent the world, while also trying to set the game up for future success. And if you think nothing else about Fallout 3, I think probably the most important thing to know about it is that it managed to do just that. But in some ways, rather expectedly I would say, it feels more like a rough draft of things to come. To my mind, Fallout 3 managed to be a sort of natural progression, it feels like, for the original titles, while at the same time, I think, with future titles, losing some of its, let's say, authenticity along the way. And that's hopefully what I'm going to paint for you across this review, because there are things I think this game does tremendously well, like atmosphere, actually feeling like a post-apocalypse, and then there's other things I don't think it does particularly well at all, such as companions being extremely one-note, and things like the ability to essentially make a perfect character every single time, making things like replayability really kind of irrelevant because you can sort of just save scum your way through the outcomes of any given situation if you just want to see those options, but even that's not really all that necessary. But ultimately, we've got a lot to talk about, so let's start getting into it. First up, with a small history lesson, let's say. So how did Bethesda find itself in the position of making a Fallout game anyway? Well, this is pretty well-known stuff, but given that it happened like 20 years ago, probably worth a mention anyway. The Fallout IP was originally owned by Interplay, the IP itself being developed, of course, by Tim Kaine. This resulted in the first two titles being made at Interplay, those being, of course, our isometric CRPGs. But how did Bethesda get tagged for the third game? Well, Interplay started running into financial trouble in the early 2000s, and in 2004, after closing Black Isle Studios in 2003, Interplay licensed out Fallout to Bethesda for 3 games where Interplay would actually retain the ownership rights of the IP. But by 2007, Interplay's financial position had continued to slip, which caused them to just wind up selling the IP outright to Bethesda, with a couple of caveats that aren't really relevant here, but long story short, that's how Bethesda wound up with the IP itself. Development began on 3 in 2004, with it fully ramping up after the release of Oblivion in 2006, before finally releasing 3 in 2008. Now, I think that's important to note because at that time, especially with problems with Interplay, etc., a lot of people were just curious to see whether the Fallout IP would survive at all, and of course, what Bethesda themselves would wind up doing with it. And for better or worse, regardless of your opinions on the matter, Bethesda has turned that IP into a massive success. But as with anything, change is never universally liked, which is at least one of the things I want to touch on in the broader strokes of this video. But with that little history lesson out of the way, let's start talking about how this game is running these days. So happy to report that this one actually wound up running much better than I initially anticipated. In fact, personally, I ran into essentially no issues, but that seems to be luck more than anything else, as for me, the game only crashed a couple of times. But a little bit of investigation into that will show you that people still have problems with the game to this day. Now, over on Steam in particular, it's worth mentioning that Fallout 3 at one time was designed to work with Games for Windows Live, which, as you may or may not know, the marketplace for which shut down in, I believe it was 2013 or 2014, which caused no small amount of problems for games that had it sort of grafted to their installation process. So for a long time there, apparently the Steam version just wouldn't start up at launch for people at all, but this was sort of fixed in like 2021 when Bethesda released a patch that formally removed all of the Games for Windows Live stuff, but there are multiple ways to remove that on your own, so it wasn't exactly something that would keep you from playing it. It was simply an annoying sort of step you had to take. So in theory, that fixed the Steam version for a lot of people just by itself, because now you don't have the Games for Windows Live stuff in there, so it should just start up. But that doesn't seem to be the case for everyone. I still see relatively recent reports of people having issues with the game starting just recently, and then I know other people will actually jump back to a previous version of the game for the sake of mod compatibility, which can come with its own issues. But speaking for my own experience, I fired it up and had zero issues. It ran right out of the box, so to speak, and the only thing that people warned me may be an issue also wound up not being anything to be concerned about. With this version of Bethesda's engine, it's known that anything above running the game at 60 FPS could cause certain things to break, but I did that the entire time with this playthrough as well, and also didn't have any problems with that. But supposedly this can lead to problems with scripting and NPCs acting erratically, but realistically the only problem this seemed to have caused for me was a specific enemy type called a Feral Ghoul Reaver, acting kind of insane. Now, you can fix this by simply capping the FPS for the game, but the reason I didn't bother to actually do that was because leaving it uncapped vastly increased things like my movement speed, but also for enemies it seems, and to be honest with you, I kind of liked it, so I left it alone. So, long story short, whether or not you have problems with this game in 2024 is going to be determined by a lot of different factors, but there's potential for not having much of any issue at all, but then on the other side of that, some people seem to experience nothing but issues. So it's hard to give you a really clear, definitive answer, but the good news is, if you're determined, this game has been out long enough that there's probably a solution to whatever issue you happen to experience in your playthrough, be it mods or workarounds, etc. But speaking of mods, this would hardly be a discussion of a Bethesda title if we didn't talk about mods in some capacity. Now, personally, for the sake of this video, I did not play with any mods at all. A couple of them were tempting, like the one that removes the filter on the game that kind of causes everything to be green and gray, but I didn't use any of that. I wanted to experience the game for what it was, outside of course, things like the increased movement speed, but it is what it is. Now, that said, because this is a Bethesda title, there's mods for basically anything and everything you could think of, including the usual visual upgrades, balance passes, content mods, unofficial patches to fix a whole host of different issues. But because of all the updates this game has had, as I mentioned just a moment ago, your success rate with those may be based on simply the version of the game you are running, which is something to keep in mind if you're planning on modding this for yourself. In particular, probably I would say the biggest mod to mention in this little section is simply the Tale of Two Wastelands mod. This one in particular allows you to effectively play Fallout 3 and New Vegas at the same time because they used the same engine and everything, but that mod allows you to use what is, in my opinion, the much improved progression systems of New Vegas. But the problem there seems to be that a lot of people have trouble installing Tales of Two Wastelands and getting it to actually work, so your mileage may vary there as well. But basically, like any Bethesda game, there are a ton of mods, a ton of options for mods, and what content you would or would like not to have with this game experience, so that's largely up to you. But otherwise, I was just interested in the base game's content for itself. Which brings us to the story and my thoughts on it. So, Fallout 3 and its character creation, alongside its story, are all kind of tied together, which I thought was kind of neat, basically meaning that in order to get started with this game, we have to naturally play out the intro sequence, which sees you making your character in a series of flashbacks, starting with your character's birth. Before deciding how you're going to wind up looking over the course of the game, though this is a relatively rudimentary character creation system where you'll just pick a few options like face presets, hairstyles, etc. You can also customize some of this stuff, but again, it's a very basic system in comparison to what would come. But once you've got that cosmetic portion out of the way, you get yet another flashback of being a baby meeting your father inside of Vault 101. So the game begins with your character's birth, and then your subsequent childhood throughout the time you spent in a vault. But the next flashback after this sees you picking your special stats in particular via a little children's book, which is where we're going to be deciding our special stats. Now, as with basically any RPG, but especially older ones, these special stats are simply not created equal. But we'll talk a little bit more about this in the progression systems portion of the video, because subsequent flashbacks from this point on show our character growing up and making moral decisions in relation to how you interact with other vault denizens, which gives you a good opportunity to understand some of the outcomes and interplay between individual actions that the game has for you. For instance, how you deal with a bully in multiple aspects of these flashbacks highlight several options you might take, but when you are 16, you then have to take the GOAT, a fancy test to determine some of your character's tagged skills, and while you can go through the questions that are very funny to go through and do that naturally, you can also just skip to the end if you want, where you'll pick your tagged skills. These are skills you get a large bonus to, making it easier to focus on them and get your character going right out of the gate. Again, we'll talk about more of this in the progression systems portion. But immediately after this flashback, our next one, starting when our character is 19, brings us to present day. So we are woken up by our friend Amada, who explains that for whatever reason our dad escaped the vault, opening the door and endangering everyone inside in order to rush off and do something, and the vault has been thrown into disarray, with the overseer in particular looking for you, since your dad ran away and naturally he thinks you know something about it. But we, of course, don't know anything, but we've got to escape the guards who are out for our blood, so we can run out into the wasteland to chase our father, as it turns out. But along the way, during this escape, we're going to run into a few different options, including, again, a few things that I think highlight what this game is all about in terms of resolving situations in unique ways. For instance, you can accept or decline a pistol from Amada when she wakes you up, and depending on your choice there, she may or may not need your help to solve a situation later. You can run into Butch and either solve his problems and protect his mom for him, or encourage him to do it himself, or simply ignore the situation entirely. All of which are going to affect Butch's opinion of you later, even though he was one of your childhood bullies that you may or may not have opinions about. There's also multiple ways to get into the Overseer's office to activate the sort of escape tunnel in order for you to get to the entrance of the vault before actually heading out. So overall, I would just say that I really enjoyed this intro overall. It introduces a lot of core mechanics and gameplay components, your first look at basic combat as well, all before throwing you out into the wild wasteland, which is going to be much less kind to you than your relatively cushy upbringing in a vault all these years. And then the subsequent part of the main story I think is also really great, because once you actually leave the vault, you basically have one goal: find your dad, and the game's not particularly picky about how you go about doing that. There are multiple ways to do this. The game will sort of spoon feed you some leads that you can follow, such as going to the nearby town of Megaton and talking to Colin Moriarty, who can tell you where your dad was seen last after he passed through Megaton himself when he escaped, and that can lead you to the Galaxy News radio building in the DC ruins. Doing a quest for the radio jockey, Three Dog there, can lead you to Rivet City, where you can meet Dr. Lee, who explains that your father is working on Project Purity, a lifelong effort of his to bring purified clean water to the denizens of the capital wasteland that we find ourselves in here in DC, instead of the very gross irradiated water everyone's been drinking. But the cool thing about this is that you don't have to really do any of that. There are whole sections of that you can skip. In fact, one relatively easy way to do it unintentionally is taking on a side quest in Megaton called the Wasteland Survival Guide, which is a cool quest, but will ultimately lead you to Rivet City, and if you talk to everybody while you're there, you're likely to meet Dr. Lee, who's going to tell you where your dad is if you ask, as she recognizes you as his son, or daughter, of course. But there are also other ways to skip around this stuff, sort of just naturally bumping into locations and finding out a bunch of information by chance, and that's honestly pretty great. I appreciate that they throw you out into this wasteland with a sort of ambiguous goal, and there are multiple ways you could solve that goal. Now, once you actually go to Project Purity, which is held in the Jefferson Memorial, your dad's not actually there, but he left behind a bunch of tapes explaining that he thinks he can probably get the Project Purity working, but he needs more information, and he has one lead: an old Vault Tech scientist, Stanislaus Braun, who was apparently holed up in Vault 112, which you then go searching for, ultimately find, and this leads you to Tranquility Lane. Tranquility Lane is a fantastic part of this game where basically you're in a computer simulation alongside the people who were initially put into Vault 112. But the thing is, Braun has been given all-access control to this simulation and has been torturing these people for the last roughly 200 years across various simulations, and you either have to play along with this, doing the guy's bidding, or find a way out of this situation in order to free your father, who you may have learned in the sort of simulation pods of Vault 112 is actually there, but you have to free him from this simulation. And you can do that a few different ways, as I mentioned, with breaking the simulation and causing an invasion by the Chinese, probably the funniest overall. You nonetheless find yourself finally directly speaking to your father himself, who confirms that he went here looking to confirm the existence of the GECK, or the Garden of Eden creation kit, which could be adapted to Project Purity to actually make it work. Now, from here, your relationship with your dad can go a few different ways. You certainly don't have to like the guy, and you can have conversations with him about the things your character has done. But where the game has done a great job of giving you choices up to this point, this is where it actually starts hemming you in a little bit. For instance, you can't go full murder hobo here and kill your father as he's marked essential, and you ultimately just start having a lot less choices in terms of how to go about things, and it starts to be a much more binary system. But from here, you're going to go to Project Purity, you're going to enlist the help of Dr. Lee and all of her scientists, and you're going to help them start getting the Project Purity facility up and running right before the Enclave shows up, takes control of the place, and your father dies, protecting you and Dr. Lee from the Enclave themselves, while also horribly irradiating the Purity control room at the same time. Now from here, you're forced to escape while fighting the Enclave with Dr. Lee and them, and once you've successfully done this, you find yourself outside the Citadel, speaking to the Brotherhood of Steel. He's going to grant you access here and also information, while at the same time permitting you to receive power armor training, and of course, more or less free reign of the facilities. More on the Brotherhood of Steel here in a little bit, but with all of this access, we can learn the location of Vault 87 from a Vault Tech computer at the Citadel. This lists a whole host of different vaults, and we're looking for one that has a Garden of Eden creation kit, so Dr. Lee and the Brotherhood could still potentially get the core of Project Purity up and running, providing free, clean water to everyone. So this becomes your next goal, but in order to get into Vault 87, which itself is a radiation hotbed, you're not going to directly access the vault. You're going to instead find a way through Little Lamplight. Little Lamplight is a settlement of just kids, which has its own background and lore and everything, but just getting into Little Lamplight can be a bit of a headache. Depending on your choices as a character up to that point, it might be as easy as simply talking your way in, or you might have to do a quest to go potentially save some kids from some slavers. But you've got a fair few options to get into Little Lamplight, and on this section of the game in particular, I have seen the occasional report, let's say, of people being upset you can't shoot your way into Little Lamplight, so to speak, and about how you could do things like that in the previous Fallout games, but realistically, I'd say everyone knows why Bethesda won't allow you to do this, which is that ratings boards exist, but also they were trying to essentially establish this IP for future success, and getting hit with controversy around that for a game like this before you even get started is obviously a bit of a non-starter for pretty much any business that wants to actually make money. But another thing that gets lost in those conversations is the fact that I think you did not want to do that in Fallout 1 and 2, ignoring entirely all the drama around it with that game in particular. But with those early games as well, even in-game, if you did that, you got hit with a reputation title that tanked the reaction from NPCs, meaning places wouldn't talk to you, sell to you. Some people would just shoot you on sight, and you'd also get bounty hunters of increasingly difficult ability to come after you as well. So it's not like it was a thing that was really happening in those games either. And it's just a weird complaint I see people make, so I wanted to comment on it when, I mean, everyone knows why they did that. But nonetheless, from there, once you're inside Little Lamplight, you have a couple more options in terms of how you want to breach Vault 87, the combat way, or a workaround via a computer you can get working to step into the vault. Now, Vault 87 is, you'll learn, where the East Coast super mutants are coming from. The vault here was doing an experiment with FEV that obviously didn't go exactly to plan and led to the creation of super mutants, who themselves went on to continue to abduct people and turn them into super mutants, creating a bit of a subplot of the game, which is that super mutants are a huge problem in and around the DC ruins because, specifically, of Vault 87 and its existence, which is why it's a horribly irradiated place. And in fact, you can learn over the course of the game that what they're doing and why they're infesting the place the way they are is that they're searching for a new source of FEV, which they are quickly running out of. Nonetheless, it's down here that you'll run into Fox, a super mutant that can join you as a companion, but he can also help you out in this dungeon specifically because as a super mutant, he's essentially immune to radiation and can go into a very irradiated part of the vault to grab the Gek for you. If anything happens to Fox and he dies, or you just don't save him, you have to do this yourself, which is much more difficult, frankly. Fox will leave right after this, and as you go to leave, you'll be abducted by the Enclave. Now, you'll probably have heard of the Enclave across the game's story because they have iBots broadcasting messages everywhere, and you can hear talk of them, but basically they're the remnants of the US government. And we'll have already met them a little bit simply because they, of course, attacked Project Purity earlier, and they think you know the codes to get the building started, as they clearly want access to it. Now, before that can happen, their Colonel Autumn, as he's called, gets pulled away by the president before the president starts speaking to you directly and basically says to come meet him in his office, and you'll have to get there by whatever means necessary because obviously he and Colonel Autumn have some sort of disagreement going on. This turns into a firefight when Colonel Autumn learns of it and basically forces everyone to attack you anyway, and we blast our way to President Eden, who actually just so happens to turn out to be a computer. And President Eden here wants us to do a very specific thing. He wants us to get Project Purity working, but to taint it with a special virus that will basically kill anything that has mutated from what is considered to be human. They've altered the FEV in some way to make this happen, but the thing is, this will kill basically everything. Super mutants, ghouls, but also any human that has been mutated in any substantial way from sort of traditional human DNA. And given the background radiation of the wasteland, that effectively means almost everyone, and you can choose to go along with this or not, which is as close to a sort of evil ending as you're gonna get, given that the core of the story is about bringing fresh, clean water to everyone. Now, either way, you'll have to take the vial of the stuff with you before you can leave, and then the game does a kind of annoying thing, which is that you can talk President Eden into blowing itself up, effectively destroying the entire area of Raven Rock, which is the Enclave base that we've been abducted to. And there are several ways to make this happen. You can simply talk him into doing it, you can have a high enough skill to do it as well, or you can find an item in the base that allows it to happen. But I wanted to talk about this specifically because this is something I think so many games get wrong that they take from Fallout 1. So Fallout 1 notoriously has the thing with the Master that if you gather a bunch of information throughout the game and you have the skills, you can talk the Master into effectively standing down, let's say. By which, I mean, of course, ending his own life when he realizes his plan isn't going to work. Now, from that, a lot of games these days have options where they'll let you talk your way out of the last boss fight, but it's usually a pure skill check, and that's the part they get wrong. Fallout 1 does this really, really well because it requires you to gather a bunch of information throughout the course of the game to explain exactly what about this plan is not going to work. But you also have to have the skills to then present that information, and if you've managed to do both of those things, then you can talk your way out of the boss fight in a way that feels incredibly earned, whereas situations like this simply do not. Because you're talking to someone who has a very clear goal in mind, and out of nowhere your character is like, hey man, what if you just offed yourself instead? And they somehow agree with that. It doesn't make any sense, and I think if games want to have a moment like that, they need to earn it, and so few games even try to. But nonetheless, that effectively brings you towards what is going to be the end of the game via the last mission, because you're going to escape Raven Rock, you'll meet up with Fox just outside, and you'll take this information back to Elder Lyons, who is effectively going to immediately attack the Enclave, who has, of course, taken over Project Purity at this point and is attempting to get it running. You can either tell him or not about the vial, but they're going to, of course, fire up their big robot Liberty Prime, who they've been trying to get working, and you've likely recognized if you've played Fallout 4 as well. And Liberty Prime is going to do what Liberty Prime does, which is spread the all-consuming power of democracy all over some Enclave soldiers, in what is honestly a really cool set piece. I really enjoyed this part of the game, even if it is obviously a bit silly, as you're effectively just following this robot while it does all the work. But then you get to Project Purity, you'll have a showdown with Colonel Autumn finally, and then you can choose what to do about the ending. Which brings us to the ending, of course. Initially, this was a very controversial thing because, well, frankly, the ending was very silly. A DLC added later, Broken Steel, sort of fixed it, but still at the same time takes a weird jab at the player for no reason, which makes it still feel a little off, frankly. But essentially, in order to properly activate Project Purity, which is about to explode if it doesn't get activated immediately, someone has to step into the extremely irradiated control room. But the reason this is silly is that in the original version of the game, your character had to be the one to do this. Nobody else would do it, which was silly because you met multiple people and companions along the way that were just straight up immune to radiation, including the one they introduced right at the end, almost seemingly for this exact purpose, who does the exact same thing for you just a little bit earlier in the form of Fox. He went to grab the Gek for you in an extremely irradiated part of that vault, but now suddenly doesn't want to keep you from your destiny. It was a very silly moment, and it was very well documented for how silly it was. Now, why they wanted to do that isn't really any surprise per se, but they didn't really write around it to make it make sense. So clearly they wanted the story to begin with your character's life, only to end with your character's death, and then reflect upon how a single person's relatively short life changed the wasteland in innumerable ways by providing everyone with this water, or alternatively, killing all the mutants. And as an idea, that's not bad, but the execution was terrible, and it was written in such a way that you're standing in front of this door with multiple people who are just straight up immune to the problem, which is another way I would say that this game's story doesn't earn the thing it's trying to do. Now, all of that was rendered relatively irrelevant by the Broken Steel DLC, which A, allows you to actually send in people who are immune to radiation to the control room, but also makes it to where you survive even if you do it anyway, as the game carries on and shows you more content from there, which we'll talk about in the DLC section. But even that ending, which revised things and tried to make it a little better, also takes a weird jab at you in the end slides about how you had to have a true hero go do the thing, which is just an unnecessary pot shot at the player for no reason. Especially when, to my mind, you could have easily just rewritten this slightly and made sure that through some contrivance of the plot, your character was the only person in that control room who could do this. Force your companions to get peeled off in some way. Make sure that you are the only person who can solve that problem right now, and you could have had your cake and ate it too. So just very odd decision making all around in terms of the story. I tell you all of that, and I go over that in detail to basically try to highlight the fact that this game does things on one hand really well at times, only to follow them up with decisions that force your hand into a very small set of decisions for seemingly no reason, that just a little bit more writing could have solved relatively easily. And that's before you even start getting into the fact that you're sort of locked into a certain role, which is going to, of course, limit gameplay options and roleplay potential, which is a whole separate conversation. So, long story short, I think the story of this game is a bit of a mixed bag. I think most of it's pretty solid, I enjoyed it for what it was, but feelings about the story aside, that's only one portion of this game, so let's get on to the others. Next up we have our progression system. So progression in Fallout 3 here follows the special system from the original games, while also of course making some core changes in order to accommodate a more FPS-oriented title. But it's also important to mention things like your character's ability and your player ability. Now, in an isometric game like a CRPG, one of my favorite genres, you're relying on character skill, and this is done through things like dice rolls, etc. to represent that. Well, in something more akin to a first-person shooter, that's very different, because your character's ability is directly tested by your own ability, where your ability to quickly move and point a cursor in order to shoot effectively is really down to your own reflexes. In order to bridge that gap, Fallout 3, and thus Bethesda, did a few different things. For starters, they introduced the VAT system, but we'll get into that in the combat section. And the rest of it is of course represented via the special system, which is obviously taken directly from the original games and kind of tries to adapt that to this. But the special system here doesn't really accomplish the level by doing. So in a game like this first-person S thing, you are directly doing certain things, and things like practicing those activities is generally how you get better at them. But with the special system, you simply gain experience, and then you put a whole bunch of skill points into that particular skill you want to get better at, and that's how you accomplish improvement, which I think just frankly doesn't feel quite as good gameplay-wise as getting better at something by actively performing that thing. And this is something that even Fallout 4 doesn't exactly fix, but there's a little less dissonance involved overall. Moreover though, right here at the beginning of this section, I want to point out that this is the area in which I think New Vegas improves upon Fallout 3 the most. New Vegas makes a lot of smart improvements to Fallout 3's initial version of this approach to the special system, such as adding traits and reducing perk choices that I think make it better overall and improve the gameplay experience. So as I talk about this, certainly keep that in mind. But last but not least, before we dive fully into the details here, is that one thing I'm not a huge fan of about Fallout 3's implementation specifically is that it's pretty easy to max out like everything. Your special stats, your skill stats, etc. You can make a literally perfect character if you want to with relatively minimal effort, which means that how I'm choosing to play through this game doesn't really matter because in the end I can do absolutely anything I want to do rather than trying to make a character who is a more focused experience, let's say, in terms of a specific gameplay style. But from there, let's talk about the special system. So this is an acronym, of course, for Strength, Perception, Endurance, Charisma, Intelligence, Agility, and Luck. Now, beyond just what they do for your skills, your special will also influence dialogue options and things that are available to you, in addition to just increasing the speech skill. But basically, each of these individual stats has derived statistics and effects alongside associated skills as well. So for instance, Strength will increase your carry weight, give you additional melee damage, but also increase your melee weapon skill. Whereas Endurance is going to affect things like your health, but also increase big guns and unarmed. So each of these individual special stats is important in its own way, but nonetheless there's a couple of clear winners as there always is. In particular, Intelligence is really important because this is going to give you more skill points per level, which means you can increase your skills even farther for the same amount of points invested. Though it's probably worth a mention that right at character creation you almost never want to take anything to the maximum of 10. This is because you'll be able to find bobbleheads and the like to permanently increase these stats by 1 to bring them to the maximum. And those bobbleheads combined with some perks as well as skill magazines for your skills makes it just very easy to max out everything by the end of the game if that's what you want to do. Agility is another great one because this gives you more action points to use in VATS. And VATS in this game is a little more important than it is in things like New Vegas or 4, where it's a little less, I would say, effective overall. I would say Fallout 3 is the game that sees me using the VAT system the most, which is why agility is a bit more important in this case. But nonetheless, once you've got your special stats sorted out, that is part of determining your base amount of skill points in all of your different skills alongside your tagged skills, and then you're going to start leveling up. So every time you level up, which is done by gaining experience from questing or fighting, you're going to be able to pick a perk as well as increase skills by your allotted number of skill points. Now right away, I would say that this is way too many perks all at once. So your perk every level is just a little too much. I prefer the perk every other level of New Vegas specifically because that allowed them to remove pointless things. Like for instance, as I mentioned, you can max out everything in Fallout 3 relatively easily, and yet in spite of that, there are a ton of perks you can pick up multiple times that do nothing but increase skills. Except the thing is, you don't need these perks to max out most skills if you know what you're doing, which means all of those perks that just relatively minimally increase certain skills are all useless. They don't need to be there at all. And having those perks right alongside other perks that actually add content to the game, like say Lawbringer or Contract Killer, which allow you to collect trophies off of certain defeated enemies and then turn them into in-game factions like the Regulators, is infinitely more interesting than stat increases you do not need. And then later on, towards the end of the game, with the Broken Steel DLC, which raises the level cap to level 30, you can pick up a perk called Almost Perfect that raises all of your base stats to 9 for your special, which means if you wait to pick up the bobbleheads at that point, or specific ones anyway, you can then max out all your special stats as well once you've hit max level, which really isn't that hard to do if you're actively exploring and everything. So again, simply put, I think the changes that New Vegas made really improved this system by simply adding traits which help define what your character is supposed to be a little more, outside of just a generic jack of all trades, on top of reducing the number of perks you can pick and making some of those more impactful as well, was a great improvement across the board to the system at play here. Now the other side of progression is of course armor and weapons. So pretty straightforward stuff. Weapons, especially as the damage you deal with them is going to scale to your associated skills, such as energy weapons, big guns, small weapons, etc. And you're obviously trying to deal the most damage, but a lot of the weapons have individual properties such as fire rate, damage type, range, etc. So there's something a little unique there, but I would say that in general, the combat in terms of the weapons you are using is also something New Vegas improved upon, with a lot of the weapons there feeling more substantial, and the weapon variety here in 3 being, I would say, a little bit sparse. And then of course the lack of a crafting system that allows you to mod these, like something with Fallout 4, which has a nearly limitless amount of weapon variety thanks to that system, is definitely of note. This is where I would say the game can definitely feel a little bit like a rough draft, let's say. Now the other side of that is your armor, of course. Now, notable right away that you cannot wear power armor even if you find it towards the beginning of the game. You have to get the power armor training perk via the either Brotherhood of Steel when you make it that far in the main story, or there's a DLC that will give it to you automatically as well. Now, armor can do all sorts of things for you, like increasing special stats while you have certain things worn, increasing resistance to radiation, etc., etc. Pretty self-explanatory stuff for the most part. But all of that gear, both armor and weapons, are subject to durability, or the armor or weapons condition, as the game calls it. Basically, as you use things, they get worn down and you have to repair them, which requires you to either take it to the merchant to be repaired, or to use your own repair skill, which involves another weapon or armor type of the same thing that you can then break down for parts to repair the thing you have. I'll be honest, I don't exactly love repair systems overall. They tend to just be tedious, but for weapons, this is kind of whatever. You're going to find so many of them so often that it's really just not a huge deal most of the time. Where I found this to be particularly annoying was actually armor, because oftentimes you're going to find yourself dealing with specific enemy types that may or may not even have armor on, and then if they have that armor, are they dropping armor you actually need, and thus can repair your gear with, etc. So when it came to that item durability mechanic, armor is where the friction seemed to be, which is why the Operation Anchorage DLC can be really good for you, because at the completion of that, you get a special set of power armor that, thanks to a bug, actually has practically infinite armor durability, which means it just lasts forever almost. Not literally, it is possible to wear it down, but it has an insanely high value for that compared to everything else, which I would say on its own is probably enough to simply make it the best armor in the game, because I'm not constantly having to repair it with things I may or may not have. And that finally brings us to the gameplay and world section. I would say where Fallout 3 shines the most in particular is its world and the exploration of it. In fact, I would go so far as to say that of all the Fallout games, Fallout 3 feels the most like exploring an actual post-apocalypse than basically any other Fallout I have played. 1 and 2 have the problem of simply being isometric, which obviously, even as someone who loves that genre, I acknowledge isn't the best for immersion specifically. Then you have things like New Vegas, which, I mean, just kind of has its own unique feel that doesn't feel particularly post-apocalyptic, as radiation and things like that are rarely an issue at all. And then for Fallout 4, I have an insanely specific example that I imagine probably won't land for most people, but Fallout 4 to me is like those construction theme parks you'll see here in the US every once in a while, where basically they have like construction equipment that is, as an example, been modified to make sure they can't move or anything, so you just interact with like the main mechanism and you can pick up like junk cars and throw them around, that type of stuff. And they even have like kid versions that allow them to operate this machinery and kind of do the cool thing. Fallout 4's atmosphere and vibe feels exactly like what I think of when I see those theme parks, which, while honestly cool in its own way, doesn't exactly feel like a post-apocalypse either. which I think is not helped by the visual aesthetic of that game changing from the more grimy aesthetic, especially in relation to things like ghouls. And for those reasons, Fallout 3, just right out of the gate, the thing I think it does the best is that it feels more like a post-apocalypse than any other Fallout game that I've played. And while I'm going to get a little into the specifics of that in just a moment, there's some general stuff I want to talk about first. The reason I feel that way is because exploration in particular is a huge part of this one, which could be said of a lot of Bethesda's titles, to be fair, but in specific to this game, you're often given objectives that simply allow you to approach them however you want, and you can explore and do whatever you want in order to pursue that objective, like finding your dad at the beginning of the game. You can just wander around for that if you want. And in so doing, you might just realize that while there are certainly big, more scripted quests and the like, a lot of places you enter and locations you find have tons of unmarked things. Things that are all sorts of interactable situations you can involve yourself in and get up to that are not marked as quests at all. They're simply there for you to discover and experience all on your own in a way that feels very organic to both the setting, but also to you as the player. So a great example of this is a place like Andale. Andale is a little town where you'll meet some people who are incredibly chipper and all about the American way of life, but a little bit of investigation into their very strange behavior will show you that what is actually happening here is that they are cannibals trying to lure people in so they can kill them and then harvest them for meat, basically. That's not an actual quest, that's just an unmarked interaction you can have at a location you may or may not find in your experience with this game. And that's just one example of dozens, and that's what I think is so great about the exploration of this game in particular. Now, all along the way of doing that, what you're going to be encountering is ultimately Bethesda's interpretation of the lore of what the Fallout universe is. And I think there's a valid enough conversation there to be had about Bethesda's interpretation of certain things that were adapted from the original approach to the IP. Now, the cool thing about this is that this is such a big and popular IP that you don't simply have to take my or anybody else's word for it. You can get the opinion on this directly from the creators of Fallout themselves. In particular, I know for a fact that Tim Kaine has put out a video, I think it was called like Lore Drift or something, where he discusses this topic in depth, and you can thus get the opinion of one of the creators on exactly how they feel about things changing and progressing over time. Because as is always the case, over time things change, and change is never universally liked. So when you see people talking about, say, Bethesda's approach to super mutants and how they brought them to the East Coast in a way that you may or may not agree with via the lore, or maybe it feels contrived to you, you don't like what they did with the overall concept of the super mutants, I can see how you would arrive at those thoughts. Now, I'll be honest, as someone who just enjoys Fallout as opposed to being exceptionally attached to it like I am with some other franchises, it's simply not that big of a deal to me. I think they did a pretty good job of explaining most things in a way that feels natural to the setting, but I understand a lot of people don't feel that way, and ultimately there will never be a situation in which everyone is in 100% agreement with Bethesda's interpretation of these things. I've simply accepted that to be what it is, and other people simply have a harder time of doing so. In fact, I would say one of the only things that feels really forced to me specifically is the situation around caps and them being used as the main currency in the game in terms of the East Coast. If you read some of the explanations behind that, and honestly how long it took them to give a specified answer in terms of the lore, that one feels, like I said, forced. But also, every game's got to use a currency, so it's kind of just whatever, at least as far as I'm concerned. But all of that aside, let's talk about some other stuff. Now, all along the way, as you progress through the wasteland, deal with all these different situations, you're going to be making effectively good or bad decisions, which brings you to the game's karma system. Now, the karma system is ultimately a morality system where based on your actions, you get good or bad boy points. I don't generally enjoy systems like this very much, as they are inherently very binary, and there's not a lot of room for any kind of middle ground. For instance, stealing items that are tagged as red is generally going to give you bad karma, but if you steal from somebody who's like a confirmed slaver, sometimes that also gives you bad karma, which just feels ridiculous. And systems like that are inherently prone to, I would say, biases, but nonetheless this karma system exists, and based on your good or negative karma, NPCs and the like will react to you appropriately. In fact, some of the game's companions can only be recruited with a very specific karma alignment, either neutral, good, or bad. But probably one of the most direct effects of karma specifically is that if you're on the good or bad spectrum of it, you'll get attacked by either the regulators or the Talon Company mercs. So that's certainly something to know. But keep in mind there are subtle changes like dialogue, etc. based on this, and it's probably worth keeping an eye on, but in general I certainly wouldn't let it keep you from doing anything, especially since a lot of the choices are not exactly morally ambiguous, outside of a few. For instance, take one of the game's biggest early game choices, like what to do about Megaton and the bomb that lies at its center. There is effectively an undetonated warhead there that you can choose to either set off, thus destroying the entirety of Megaton, of course, or you could simply disarm the bomb, which is objectively the right thing to do, as I think it's safe to say that setting off nukes in an already devastated wasteland in one of the few fringes of society left, causing even more loss of life, is pretty objectively bad. But even then, you can do that at the behest of Mr. Burke and his employer, Alistair Tenpenny, who wants it destroyed simply because it is an eyesore to their abode in Tenpenny Tower. And while you can certainly see that playing out in a few different ways in either situation, the reward is effectively the same, which is a little disappointing, but basically you get a house either in Megaton or Tenpenny Tower, and you can spruce that place up to give you a whole bunch of little perks and places to rest and kick up your feet, so to speak. And while the situation surrounding the bomb and whether or not to set it off might be a little bit silly, it's just one of the things you can get up to. In fact, one of my favorite quests wound up being Oasis, where you can, in contrast to the very dark and dreary wasteland otherwise, run into a place called Oasis, which has trees and a ton of greenery to add to a very different feeling to the rest of the game. This also winds up tying into the original couple games with Harold, as you quickly learn that the reason behind this and how this area was able to grow is that Harold traveled here before ultimately being pinned down by the tree that was growing out of his head, becoming sort of a mutant living tree that has only continued to grow after this, causing the sort of explosion of greenery surrounding this particular area. But Harold has found this a pretty miserable existence, especially with the people that have popped up around his oasis to take care of him, not really listening to anything he says, and he wants to die. And you have a few different options to go about either doing that or siding with one of his tree minders to allow for expansion of this little grove. You can either curtail some of the growth and make sure that the wasteland isn't going to see any of his trees for some time, allowing them to take care of Harold in continuation, even though that's against his wishes of wanting to die. You can also side with another one of the tree minders that will cause the grove to explode in growth and grow even faster and more, which would arguably be much better for the rest of the wasteland, but again, be against Harold's wishes. You can choose to actually kill Harold if that's what you want by descending to find where his heart went, or you could just set the guy on fire, despite him being terrified of fire, which is a deeply messed up thing to do, while also turning the entire grove hostile on you, which is a great quest overall for simply how it throws back to the original games, but also how it tackles questions like assisted suicide, and whether it's right to make this one person suffer at the expense of helping basically everyone else in the wasteland by causing this grove to flourish. But as simple as that quest might initially seem, I think it's asking some big questions. Another throwback to past games is a sort of temporarily available quest known as Trouble on the Home Front, in which you can receive a radio signal that talks about some problems currently occurring back in Vault 101 after you leave the vault, where the Overseer has effectively continued to be a problem even after you left, and the younger kids are at odds with the older generation here, as some of them want to leave the vault the way you did, and the Overseer wants to lock it down so nobody can leave, and you've got some ways to side with people here or make some decisions, but you can do a lot here. You can effectively keep the vault closed through a number of methods, but simply by ignoring the message. For instance, entering and then immediately leaving, killing all the rebels or the younger kids, simply persuading them into giving up their ambitions of leaving the vault at some point. You can then open the vault up instead by either just straight up killing the Overseer, convincing him to step down and passing his work to his daughter Amata if he lived in the prologue, or you'll simply be forced to kill him if it's his successor. And then there's another option to just straight up destroy the vault. Say you're real mad about what happened to you, as an example. There's actually a way you can sabotage the vault that has to deal with breaking its water chip, another throwback to the original games. But even if you resolve this situation one way or another, you're going to be asked to leave, echoing that famous phrase from the first game about how you're a hero and I need you to leave. because you're at risk of hurting the rest of the vault, basically. And stuff like that is a fantastic throwback to the originals while still adding something new to the, now in like 2008, but in general. But then even still, there's other stuff that's kind of just funny, like with the Republic of Dave and how it's just one little compound where someone has decided that this is their own little nation, and you can go there and either just, shoot up the place if you want, or get involved in a little election day type thing where people are going to vote for the governor there, which, as the name of the place might imply, is typically Dave. And all of those great, more curated moments on top of all of the fantastic exploration and the unmarked areas of the game, I think makes for a really tremendous experience exploring and interacting with a lot of this content. And to my mind, at least, I think a lot of it showed a great deal of love for the actual source material at the same time, while also still trying to do their own thing and advance the world and setting a bit. Now, in spite of that, I don't think everything is done perfectly well here. I think there are a fair few problems with this setup. For starters, very surprising to me, I did not realize that there were no joinable factions really in Fallout 3. You can technically join the Brotherhood of Steel as part of the Broken Steel DLC, and you're kind of a de facto member as part of the main story anyway. But outside of that, you don't really join any factions. You simply go to locations, deal with a relatively localized problem, enjoy it, and move on your way. And given that the rest of the quests are also unmarked at the same time, this can certainly lead to feelings of the wasteland of Fallout 3 being a little devoid of content if you're not making an effort to actively explore absolutely everything you come across. And that's not exactly helped by things like companions. This game has a whole host of companions, and outside of Dogmeat and Fox, I don't think a lot of them are terribly interesting. They don't really have a ton of content associated with them outside of their initial recruitment, and they don't exactly have a ton to say otherwise either. Although they can certainly be useful companions in combat specifically, as a lot of them scale directly to your level, so their combat effectiveness increases as yours does, but they can also die permanently if they die in combat, which is going to happen sooner or later, I would imagine, to most of them, with the exceptions of Dogmeat and Fox. This is because their health is astronomical in comparison to everyone else's, and in fact there's a perk for Dogmeat specifically that allows you to just go pick him back up again via one of his puppies if he happens to actually die in combat, which is rare because of his astronomical health numbers. But there's still a whole host of little things I want to mention as well. There's stuff like power armor. As I mentioned, you can't put on power armor unless you have power armor training, but even then it functions effectively just like items you would wear otherwise, and this is actually something I think Fallout 4 improved on a great deal, because there, while you get power armor very, very quickly, it feels much better to actually use, and like you're actually wearing a suit of something as you have to like enter into it and use fusion cores and stuff, as opposed to effectively just putting on a shirt like you would any other piece of armor in the game. So while power armor is fantastically effective, I do think 4 really captured the feeling of using it much, much better. Other things I wanted to mention are that the metro system is indeed terrible. The game is effectively divided up on its world map into the Wasteland area and then the DC Ruins. The DC Ruins being the ruins of an entire proper city is obviously a hard thing to render in technology via 2008 tech. Thus, what they did instead was divided up the DC ruins into a whole host of smaller separate maps divided by the metro system. The metro system effectively just acting as tunnels from one of these maps to the next, before going and visiting iconic places like the Washington Monument, the White House, and a whole host of other locales specific to DC, that honestly seeing them in tattered ruins of a post-apocalypse makes for some fantastically iconic shots that I don't think get quite enough attention. And speaking of that attention, this game is so fantastically dense of just little details that you may or may not find. There's all sorts of stuff with those American monuments that I just mentioned and how the history of them ties into the place even now, such as the quest to go get the Declaration of Independence or other types of important relics and monuments, such as with Abraham Lincoln and the Temple of the Union quest that sees you potentially giving a bunch of prior slaves a place to feel safe while also setting up an option to let them be a sort of bastion for runaway slaves. And then there's Paradise Falls and the fact that they're a bunch of child slavers, which means all of them have to die in every playthrough. And I didn't even mention incredibly charismatic characters like Moira Brown, who gives you the Wasteland Survival Guide, which then goes on to show up in other places and teaches you the basics of surviving in the wasteland. I also didn't talk much about radiation specifically, or radiation sickness, and how it has a direct effect on your character, but I also think Fallout 4 improved this as well by causing it to cut directly into your health bar as opposed to just being an increasingly detrimental status effect. And while there are certainly areas of this game that I think are a bit lacking, it genuinely is impressive how much they managed to pack in here into this relatively confined space, let's say. But with all of that out of the way, let's from there talk a little bit about combat, which will ultimately be a much shorter section. First and foremost though, let's talk about VATS, or your Vault Assisted Targeting System. VATS is intended as a way to bridge the gap between player skill and your character's skill. As the switch to a more first-person shooter-oriented type of game, people were worried that this would be less and less of an RPG as it stands, which is still a concern some people have these days, but one of the things they came up with to assist with that was actually VATS, and surprisingly, I would say that I used this more in Fallout 3 than I did any other game in this series, specifically because of how effective it is at doing just that, getting you to rely more on your character's skill than your own. This is caused by things like the aim down sights on various weapons not really being an aim down sights, but rather a simple zoom in, which is itself pretty limited because what you are supposed to be doing is entering into VATS and using your character's action points based on their agility to target individual portions of an enemy's body, such as limbs, their actual body, or their head, etc., in a manner similar to the aimed shot of the original 2 games. But when you actually start shooting, enemies will continue to move afterwards as well, and that's important because as enemies move in that slower time after you actually confirm your attacks in VATS, they can wind up moving behind cover or something, which will see you miss even if you had a high percentage chance to hit them. And it also, of course, highlights the actual limb system present in the game. You have your overall health, of course, but your individual limbs or parts of your body and enemies also have their own health pools, and they can be crippled, causing the reduction of certain stats or causing them to even drop their weapon potentially, etc., giving you another few options to approach combat with. There are several perks as well that are specifically designed to make you better in VATS, again relying more on your character skill and their weapon skill than your own. It also gives you reduced damage while you're using VATS, and it was crazy high in Fallout 3 specifically, like 90%, so you would take very little damage in this mode, basically giving you more and more reasons to actually use it, and followed by subsequent games which increase the damage you take while using it, and then Fallout 4 actually just slows time while you're trying to pick your targets as opposed to outright stopping it. Fallout 3, I would say, is the game that incentivized the use of VATS more than any of the others, or at least the 3 games that had it if you don't count 76. And again, that just leads to a situation where I'm more inclined to rely on my character's skill rather than my skill as a player. But at the same time, I think that leaves you as a game in sort of an awkward position where you have to put general gameplay at odds with how the game actually functions. Because say what you will, Fallout 4 plays better than Fallout 3, which is helped a great deal by the fact that the shooting and the things like that are simply much better to use. But as a result of them feeling better for you, the player, it relies less and less on your skills as a character, which has that effect of making some things feel less like an RPG overall. So it's an interesting conversation, and I think the concept of VATS is really fantastic, and at the very least, I was inclined to use it more in this game than the others. But that's not all, of course. We then have the various weapon types you can get up to. A lot of weapons have individual components that make them interesting to use, especially since compared to New Vegas, Fallout 3 here uses damage resistance instead of damage threshold, whereas threshold was just flat reduction of damage. Resistance, which we see at play here, is just a percentage reduction of incoming damage, which functions a little bit differently, which at the very least makes things like shotguns a little more fun to use here than somewhere like New Vegas, where the damage is based off of the number of projectiles from the shotgun either way, and thus each of the individual projectiles deals a relatively small amount of damage, meaning that anything with a decent damage threshold in something like New Vegas takes basically 0 damage from your attack, whereas damage resistance makes that a little bit more fun to play around with in that specific instance, but I think that specifically is going to be a matter of preference more than anything else. But the fun of this one, at least for me, was finding unique weapons and their unique properties. For instance, you can craft a whole bunch of items. There's even a perk if you don't want to find the schematics for all of them, as you have to find the schematics normally, but you can pick up a perk that just gives you all of the schematics or ability to craft these at a workbench, which I think was the beginnings of the crafting system in something like Fallout 4, which is obviously much more customizable. But here we can still do cool stuff, like you could potentially get a Deathclaw Gauntlet, and while it doesn't deal the most damage overall, it also bypasses armor altogether, which means it's a fantastic weapon to use if you want to do a sort of unarmed build. So while I wouldn't say the weapon variety of this particular game is outrageous or anything, learning how those weapons work on an individual basis in terms of, the type of weapon you're using, and then combining that with searching for and finding unique weapons of that type that then themselves function a little bit differently, can still be really interactive and fun, which I would say is probably helped along a little bit by the fact that the character system in this is so broad that you don't have to really pick a specific type of character to play. You can absolutely do that maxed out jack of all trades approach, which means all this interesting weaponry and the specifics of it can be found and interacted with here, without having to say roll up a new character for a specific type of weapon necessarily. But very broadly speaking about the combat, it can certainly feel a little janky at times, almost certainly down to both the age of the game itself as well as the specific design decisions that were made around VATS and trying to make your player skill not matter as much as your character's skill, which I think is important to keep in mind when you look back at games like this. But nonetheless, that brings us to our DLC before we start moving to wrap this up. So let's talk about DLC and Fallout 3. Now, I want to state right away, this game has a hotkey system where you can assign individual bits of equipment to various hotkeys. That's great until you come up with a moment that takes all of your character's equipment away and thus wipes all of their hotkeys out, and then you give that equipment back and they have to reset all of those hotkeys. And like every one of the DLCs does this to you, and it's very annoying. But nonetheless, Fallout 3 got quite a few different DLCs. In fact, there are 5 specifically that we need to talk about that added a great deal of content to the game. And those are Broken Steel, Point Lookout, Mothership Zeta, Operation Anchorage, and Into the Pit, each adding their own little bits of content and more to explore. I have mostly good feelings about the bulk of them, but not necessarily all in some cases. But let's start with Broken Steel. So this picks up immediately after the ending of the game, and it adds a fair bit to the game as well, increasing the level cap to 30, introducing a whole host of perks and things to go along with that. It also added new enemy types, including the Super Mutant Overlord, which was the bane of my existence, but naturally also a whole host of quests. At the end of the game, the Brotherhood of Steel is effectively in control of the Project Purity over at the Jefferson Memorial, which is allowing them to distribute water. They're also fighting what's left of the Enclave, which seems remarkably well organized in spite of you having rendered them more than one defeat back to back. This sees us doing a few things. We can help the Brotherhood of Steel with distributing water, which leads to a lot of fun side quests around exactly that and how people are getting along with all this fresh, clean water they now have. But also, you gotta fight the remnants of the Enclave, and this starts out with you once again running around with Liberty Prime before he is destroyed with an orbital strike. That's obviously a huge blow to the Brotherhood of Steel's already relatively crippled war effort, because the Brotherhood of Steel has been in the Capital Wasteland for 20 years before this game starts, fighting super mutants at the loss of manpower and everything, trying to keep them contained. So finally having a military advantage in an operational Liberty Prime only to have it suddenly taken away again is a pretty big blow, and they're also still trying to get rid of the Enclave remnants, and we continue to do that before taking on their mobile base crawler at the Adams Air Force Base. And at the very end of this one, you can choose yet another diabolically evil option to destroy the Brotherhood of Steel and their citadel, or, of course, the intended target, the crawler at the Adams Air Force Base. This is a really fun DLC, both in terms of what it adds to the game, how it changes the ending itself, adds more post-game content, and a bunch of really interesting side content as well. So Broken Steel, I would say, is definitely one of the more important ones, but realistically, you're probably going to buy all this in a bundle anyway. Then we have Point Lookout. This is a creepy one, honestly. So we get word of a riverboat that can take us to Point Lookout, a sort of desolate swamp area ripe for treasure hunters, as it were, before we quickly get involved in the great game between two different individual characters. Now, this one might be of interest to people specifically because of the recent Fallout TV show, kind of hinting at what the great game is supposed to be. But basically, we see people that have been around since the pre-war era, and how they've been fighting each other across hundreds of years, effectively. And it's a pretty interesting story overall. But also, the just area of Point Lookout is pretty intense as well. A lot of very, let's say, upsetting elements to that one, including some mutated locals, new enemy types to fight, as well as some tribals as well, who have a very twisted way of thinking, due in no small part to some psychic domination happening, and it's a pretty messed up one. But I think probably the coolest part about it is actually interacting with the sort of Cthulhu-esque portions of it, or the occult mystery parts, as you can get yourself involved in a side quest around stealing a book called the Krivbekna, which was stolen by some swamp folk from a man named Obadiah Blackhall, and the sort of Lovecraftian horror stuff that's been worked into some of the Fallout universe has always been pretty interesting to me. So I enjoyed that one a fair bit, and overall I would say Point Lookout is really just creepy more than anything else. But then we have Operation Anchorage. So this will allow us to help out the Brotherhood outcasts, or the members of the Brotherhood that are not fond of Elder Lion's departure from the main goal of the Brotherhood of simply collecting technology and leaving, but rather trying to protect the people of this wasteland from the super mutants, which is not exactly their job, let's say. But the outcasts in particular are trying to get into an armory at their HQ if you go there. And they need somebody with a Pip-Boy, which is obviously where we come in, because we have one of those. And this will hook you up to a simulation that is about the retaking of Anchorage from the Chinese invasion as part of the pre-war history of the universe. You can directly participate in that here and see some of those events for yourself directly. The safety precautions are off though, so if you die in the simulation, you'll die for real. And not just in the video game, like actually for real. So the stakes for the DLC are pretty high, of course. But joking, obviously. Nonetheless, though, this simulation plays a little bit differently than the rest of the game, as you have like limited ammo and weapon types, and at one point you'll be in control of a squad and everything. So it's an interesting way to play through the game, while also at the same time seeing a pretty big historical event from the game. And in particular, you can see the type of power armor that was deployed during this assault that helped win. And once you've done this, having completed this training will give you access to the armory inside this outcast base. However, at the same time, they were effectively just using you to get into the vault, and there will be a sort of fight in between outcasts here, and then they will try to kill you as well once you get to that point of this story. But this gives you access to the T-51B winterized power armor, which, as I mentioned, thanks to a bug, has an enormous amount of armor health, which means you don't have to constantly repair it, which is honestly really great. This also is the DLC that gives you access to the Gauss rifle, which is a pretty tremendous bit of weaponry all on its own. So a pretty cool DLC. That one wound up being much better than I thought it was going to be. I honestly figured that, because I kind of already knew what was going to happen, and it mostly just being a combat-oriented thing, I really didn't go into Anchorage expecting much, but it wound up being a much more enjoyable experience than I initially thought it was going to be. Which kind of is the opposite case for the Into the Pit DLC. So before I tell you about this DLC, I've got to tell you that something happened while I was playing it that was really funny that I just thought might be fun to share. So the Into the Pit DLC, during a certain portion of it, can see you turning off the floodlights of a given area, sort of cutting the power to them. And as I did that in the game, maybe 2 seconds after that, my actual power went out thanks to a storm, and this was at like midnight. So that was an incredibly immersive moment that I don't think Bethesda intended, but I got a really big laugh out of. But Into the Pit once again sees us investigating a radio signal, and this time it puts us in contact with a man named Werner. He is from an area called the Pit, which is a settlement that has a huge problem with a plague going around. It mutates, or usually just kills people in most cases, but the leader of this settlement, Asher, apparently has a cure to it, and he would like your help in going to get that cure. Now from there, we're supposed to get a slave outfit and sneak into the area of the pit as a slave, where we can work our way closer and closer to the pit's leader, Asher, before a big decision is made. But I will say that this DLC in particular felt more like it was forcing you into a decision than anything else did. For instance, they give you some conversation options around maybe trying to join the raiders here or just blasting your way in through the front door, but they very quickly force you into what the game wants to happen here, which is that you're supposed to act as a slave in this one particular section before, again, working your way to Asher. And the game is really not prepared for you to do anything else, so even if you come in here with a really high level character and immediately just start killing the raiders even after they beat you the first time if you killed your way through the front door, there's really not much of an effect otherwise. So this is one of those DLCs where you unfortunately just kind of have to accept what it is until you get to a point at which you can make a decision. So that was kind of annoying, but basically you do a few tasks to work your way up as a slave and eventually fight your way through an arena to be accepted into the sort of upper echelon of raiders here. And ultimately, you're going to have to deal with a situation that, to the game's credit, doesn't really have a good ending. It's just various stages of bad, basically. So Asher does in fact have a cure of sorts to the disease that is running rampant among all the slaves and everything of the area. However, the cure is the fact that a little girl was born who was immune to this disease, and they plan on doing research to develop this cure and then distribute it amongst the slaves that are doing all the work to effectively turn the pit into a giant steel manufactory. But obviously you have to let the slave operation continue for that to happen. Otherwise, you can kidnap the little girl and allow the slaves to do as much research as possible to try to make a cure, but it's unlikely to ever come to fruition, and the city itself will also probably not be rebuilt either, but the slaves will be freed from their slavers who were working them to death to begin with. So as much as this particular DLC kind of forces you into certain paths, I will say that I loved the morally ambiguous nature of it in particular, and I think they did really well with that part. And it's an interesting story from that specific standpoint, but broadly it was a little too fenced in for my taste. And that leaves us with the final DLC, Mothership Zeta. This one is pretty much what you see is what you get, as it sees you abducted by aliens and having to fight your way off of their mothership, of course. And this tells the story of the aliens that have kind of been in the game since the very first game, and more directly, obviously, interfaces with them as opposed to just a sly reference here and there. This particular DLC is a lot of silly fun in that you get to, of course, fight all of these aliens and everything that goes along with that, but it's also a place where you can find a tremendous amount of fantastic energy weapons. The alien ones are really strong, and at the very end of it, you can actually pick up an alien blaster, which is a fantastically deadly weapon, but unfortunately has a bit of a limited ammo supply, but you can get a lot of that ammo throughout the DLC. Beyond just that, though, this particular DLC also has a really interesting story that sees you interacting both with other abductees of the aliens, but also kind of explains a little bit about what these aliens are doing. They're apparently a pretty frail species and they'd like to do something about that, so it seems that they're splicing their DNA with the humans they're abducting as they're studying them in an effort to make their own species more resilient. And there's even a portion of this where you get to actually sort of spacewalk, which I thought was kind of neat. But more than anything, I would say this particular DLC is just fun, which was honestly what I wanted out of it the most and what it wound up being. It was very silly, and I enjoyed going through it, even if it does feel, I would say, very, let's say, distinct from the rest of the game, to be sure. It was still a fun little romp through essentially a big dungeon. And now, just a quick note on Steam Deck compatibility. Fallout 3 is very playable on the Steam Deck, even via the Steam Game of the Year edition, and while it has a rating of playable, some of the reasons for that playable rating seem a little bit contrived, to be honest. For instance, you have to bring up the virtual keyboard to name your character, and before you actually start the game, the default resolution on the Steam Deck isn't exactly the Steam Deck's resolution, but it supports that resolution, so you have to click like 2 buttons to fix it. And supposedly some of the game's basic functionality is not available via the control scheme, or at least the default one that is. Though I will say personally, as somebody who prefers keyboard and mouse in every instance essentially, but especially games like this where I have to aim, I would struggle to play this on the Steam Deck. Just very generally, though that's where something like the VAT system in particular would come in particularly handy. But long story short, the game is very playable there. You got controller support, cloud saves, you can adjust everything, you can mod it there if you really want to. And at least for me, it ran just as well there as it did on PC. So if that's something you want to do, you should definitely be able to make it happen. But all of that finally brings us to our positives and negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So the positives for me about Fallout 3 are definitely down to just the sheer atmosphere of this one. Like I said earlier, Fallout 3 to me feels more like a post-apocalyptic imagining of what this Fallout universe is supposed to be than any of the other games. And it captures that desolate and somewhat lonely feeling at times more so than the others as well. And I really loved that. Moreover though, exploration is also fantastically done here. Every location has a bunch of interactions, be they marked as a proper quest or not. There's all sorts of lore and things to find out about that this game of course introduced as they were trying to expand and move the game into the future from the previous entries as well. And exploring and discovering all of those little details along the way, I think is where this game shines the most. Now, on the negative side of things, there's the obvious stuff, like sort of the janky gameplay things that haven't exactly aged super well. Obviously, things like the aim-down sights, etc. were improved with later titles, and some of these systems you can even see improved by New Vegas just a short time later, such as the awkward progression systems. And to my mind, one of the biggest negatives is simply that the progression systems of this game are such that they're a little frustrating to interact with generally just because they're throwing so many perks at you, and it's also so easy to make a maxed out character that you are effectively a jack of all trades no matter what you do. And the fact that there isn't exactly a big branching narrative that we see in games like Obsidian's New Vegas means that there just isn't a lot of replayability, both in terms of approaches to things like combat and character development, but also just in terms of options, etc., because each of these individual areas of the game is relatively self-contained, and it's pretty easy to sort of just see what the other side of that quest would be by save scumming and checking it out for yourself. And ultimately, the game has plenty of choices, but not exactly a lot of consequences for those choices. Which brings me to my conclusion. I would say Fallout 3 had a pretty monumental task in terms of what this franchise is, in that it had to, of course, bring all of the universe into a brand new genre effectively, while at the same time presenting that in a way that was going to set up where they wanted the game and the IP, etc. to go in the future. And remarkably, I think they pretty much managed to do that. Because for as long as this review is, there's tons of stuff I didn't even touch on, like the other vaults you can explore, and the other experiments they got up to in those said vaults. So while I certainly think people can argue about the perspective and approaches that Bethesda has taken to adapting and putting their own spin on the franchise as a whole since Fallout 3, I honestly think it's remarkable how much of the core identity of this they've managed to retain and bring forward with the game at the same time. So while I would definitely not call this game perfect or anything, it's pretty remarkable just in that sense alone. Now, specifically speaking on that a little bit, I think New Vegas does a lot of great things that I prefer gameplay-wise, sure. I think it vastly improves the progression systems. In particular, I prefer the way that New Vegas tells its narrative, offering you multiple paths through the story that are mutually exclusive with each other, even if that does fit into the broader format of what Obsidian does with all of its games. As if you've played a lot of their titles like I have, you will notice that a lot of them have a very similar narrative structure, even with that branching route. But not even talking about New Vegas, but the other Fallout game that Bethesda has made via Fallout 4. I think even Fallout 4 goes to further improve a lot of this stuff. I think 4 has a much better feeling power armor system, for instance. I think 4 attempted to do the branching narrative route that sees you siding with a bunch of different factions as an example as well. But unfortunately, I think that they wrote that in such a way where it's just not as satisfying as Obsidian's approach to much the same thing. And for those reasons, I can certainly see why people would prefer New Vegas in a great many instances. But speaking for myself, having finally played this and sort of put the pieces together, I will say that I'm glad Fallout 3 exists. I'm glad that it managed to invigorate people with such a passion for this franchise, because while I admit it's not my favorite franchise by far, I enjoy seeing people get so caught up in how much they care about things, because there are plenty of franchises I personally also feel that way about. So whether you enjoy Fallout 3 or not, I think it's undeniable that it laid the groundwork for what the franchise would become, which is what allowed for something like New Vegas to exist in the first place. But I think that is just about everything I've got to say on this particular piece of gaming history, and I'll spare you the usual recommendation because at the end of the day, Fallout 3 is one of those games that saw an enormous success. Obviously, the Fallout franchise is gigantic these days, and I think games like this are worth playing purely based on their value to gaming history, even if you don't enjoy the game itself. But then again, I play video games all day, every day for a living, so other people naturally feel differently. In any event, I'm glad I played through this one. I'm excited for a future Fallout 5 title and what that might do for the franchise as well. I think something like that has huge potential, especially with how big the franchise has gotten since these games have been made, including Fallout 4, of course. But if there's one thing I can absolutely assure you about the future of this franchise is that much in the same way that war never changes, change is never universally liked anyway. And so I'm sure that any changes made in that game will be as much talked about and discussed as every other game in this franchise has been up to this point. But regardless of all of that, that's pretty much going to do it for me today. So I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, though I doubt much of anybody needs any prodding to tell me all about these particular games, so I'm looking forward to reading your comments on it. But regardless of all of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.